The polished leather soles of Richard Coleman's shoes echoed through the crumbling hallway like a foreign language no one had spoken in years. The building smelled of mildew, rusted metal, and unspoken hardship. To Richard, this was just another stop on his Monday checklist, one of dozens of properties folded neatly into his real estate portfolio like pressed shirts. He was a man of order, of timing, of profit. The door to apartment 3B was chipped, the number barely hanging by a rusted screw. He adjusted his silk tie out of habit and knocked twice, firm and impersonal. No response. He sighed, reached into his blazer for a business card, maybe just leave a note, but then the lock clicked. The door opened no more than a foot, and a pair of cautious, dark eyes met his. A girl, no older than 10, maybe 11, skin the color of burnt sugar, hair pulled into rough braids. But what arrested him wasn't her appearance, it was the mechanical whirring of an old sewing machine in the background, the rhythmic hum cutting through the silence like a heartbeat. "Can I help you?" she asked. Her voice was soft, but not timid, steady, like she'd already calculated the cost of fear and found it too expensive. Richard hesitated, suddenly aware of the absurdity of his Italian suit in this faded corridor. "I'm here about the rent. Your mother is sleeping," the girl said, stepping aside just enough for him to glimpse the dim apartment behind her. "She's sick." Richard hovered at the threshold, unsure whether to step in or retreat. Something about this child's presence made him feel off balance. Inside the apartment was a tapestry of contradiction. The furniture was sparse but clean. Dim light filtered through heavy curtains. But in the far corner, where sunbeams managed to sneak through a tear in the fabric, sat a battered sewing machine flanked by piles of colorful fabric, meticulously folded, organized by hue and texture. The girl returned to her seat without waiting for permission. The machine resumed its soft hum. Richard stood awkwardly by the door. "You're 2 weeks behind," he said finally. She nodded. "I know." He cleared his throat. "I'll need payment by Friday." Without pause, the girl stopped the machine, wiped her hands on a frayed cloth, and walked to a wooden box beneath the table. She pulled out a worn envelope and handed it to him. "It's half. The rest will come when I finish these dresses. Mrs. Patterson pays by the piece." He opened the envelope, counted the crumpled bills, barely $200. His instinct told him to press, to remind her this wasn't a charity, but something in her eyes stopped him. They weren't pleading, they weren't ashamed, they were resigned, tired, fierce. "You shouldn't be doing this," he said before he could stop himself. "You should be in school." She tilted her head. "And who would pay the rent?" From the back room came a racking cough, wet, hollow, painful. Richard flinched. The girl didn't. "She's had pneumonia before. It comes and goes. The doctor said rest is the most important thing." "And you take care of everything?" A nod. "What's your name?" "Zoe Williams." It echoed in his mind as he descended the staircase. Zoe Williams, a name far too composed for such small shoulders. In the back of his Tesla, driving past rows of crumbling brick and boarded-up windows, Richard stared out without really seeing. He had grown up in mansions, summered in Monaco, graduated from Yale with honors. Children like Zoe were statistics in his world: occupancy rates, eviction filings, insurance write-offs. That night he couldn't sleep. The image of small hands threading needles in dim light haunted him. 2 days later, a call interrupted a high-stakes meeting at Coleman Estates. "Mr. Coleman, this is Mercy Hospital. You've been listed as the emergency contact for an Elaine Williams." He blinked. "I'm sorry? Who?" "Her daughter Zoe gave you your number. She said you're the landlord." In the conference room full of board members and spreadsheets, Richard Coleman stood up and walked out without a word. He found Zoe curled on a plastic chair in the ER, her backpack at her feet, face pale under the harsh fluorescent lights. The nurse at the ICU desk looked Richard up and down with the kind of suspicion reserved for men in expensive suits who claimed to be guardians of black children from low-income neighborhoods. "Immediate family only," she said, folding her arms across her chest. Zoe stepped forward without flinching. "He's my uncle." Richard blinked. She didn't even hesitate. The nurse raised an eyebrow, but, after a beat, sighed. 5 minutes. Inside, the room was dim and sterile. Machines beeped steadily, and the frail frame of Elaine Williams lay almost motionless beneath the sheets. Her breathing was labored. Oxygen tubes curled around her face. She looked impossibly small. Zoe stood silently at her mother's side, resting her tiny hand on Elaine's arm. Richard watched from the doorway, his thoughts a hurricane. This wasn't what he came for. This wasn't his problem. And yet, here he was. "She needs extended care," said a voice behind him. He turned to find a tall man in a white coat. "I'm Dr. Carson. Elaine's condition is serious, pneumonia compounded by latent tuberculosis. She'll need to stay at least 3 weeks." 3 weeks? Richard glanced at Zoe. That's when she said it. "They're going to take me away." "What?" "Social services. If she's here more than 3 days and they find out I'm alone," her voice dropped, "they'll put me in a shelter." It was then that Diana Morris arrived. Middle-aged, clipboard, government badge, all business. "Zoe Williams." Zoe instinctively stepped behind Richard, her hand gripping his coat. "I'm Diana Morris with Child Protective Services. We need to discuss temporary placement." Richard stepped forward. "She's under my supervision." Diana arched an eyebrow. "And you are?" "Richard Coleman. I own the property where they live. Elaine asked me to watch over Zoe while she's recovering." "Do you have legal documentation of that arrangement?" "No," he said, "but I can get it today. My attorney will draft it." "You expect us to hand over custody based on a verbal claim and a suit?" Richard didn't flinch. "I expect you to not separate a sick woman from her daughter when there's a better option available." Diana's expression was unreadable. "I'm watching you, Mr. Coleman. If anything seems off, you'll have the state knocking on your door before nightfall." Later that evening, in the back seat of his Tesla, Richard called his attorney. "You want to what?" Martin Goldstein almost choked on the other end. "Temporary custody," Richard repeated calmly. "You've never raised a plant, let alone a child." "She's not going into the system, Martin. Draft what we need. Expedite it." "This could tank your reputation. What are your investors going to say when they find out their CEO has suddenly turned foster dad?" Richard paused. "Let them talk. I have nothing to hide." But that wasn't entirely true. As they drove toward his penthouse, something stirred deep inside him. Guilt? Fear? A memory? He couldn't place it. The elevator ride to the top floor was quiet. Zoe stood in awe as the doors opened to reveal a marble entryway, floor-to-ceiling windows, and city lights that glittered like a galaxy at his feet. "You can choose any room," he said. "I'd rather stay near the hospital," she replied. "That's not allowed, Zoe. You need rest." "I have work to do. Mrs. Patterson paid me in advance." Richard looked at her small hands, cracked and wrapped in medical tape. "We don't need that money right now." "I do," she said, locking eyes with him. "It's my responsibility." For a moment, Richard saw her not as a child, but as a mirror to something long buried, someone who bore more weight than her age should ever allow. The next day, in Martin's law office, Diana sat across from them, arms folded. "It's highly irregular," she said. I'm not adopting her, Richard clarified. I'm providing shelter, stability, until her mother recovers. And what does Zoe think? Everyone turned to her. In foster homes, they don't let you. A week passed. Zoe fell into a quiet rhythm at the penthouse. Schoolwork by morning, sewing in the sunroom after lunch, hospital visits in the evening. But all the while she was unraveling something much bigger than a seam. She moved like a shadow in Richard's world. He had grown used to her presence, not as an intrusion, but as a strange kind of compass. She asked few questions, but she watched everything, listened carefully, absorbed. One afternoon, as Richard reviewed lease contracts from his downtown properties, Zoe stood behind him silently. Her gaze fell on a document labeled Building 12C, Historical Exemption Clause. It bore the Coleman Estates logo. "Why hasn't our rent gone up in 5 years?" she asked. Richard turned. "What?" "Our apartment, same rent, but other tenants in our building said their rent keeps going up." He frowned. "I don't know. I'll look into it." Zoe nodded, then turned to go, but her words stuck in his mind. Later that evening, he pulled up archived building records. And there it was. Elaine Williams, tenant of record. Handwritten notes in an old file. Verbal agreement with former owner. Sewing services in exchange for deferred increases. No formal lease adjustment. No signature from corporate HQ. Richard leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen. She'd been working. For free. Meanwhile, at the Coleman Estates headquarters, Victoria Reynolds was gathering ammunition. She stood before the board of directors with photos projected behind her, grainy shots of Richard escorting Zoe out of Child Protective Services, others of them entering the hospital together. "This is unacceptable," she said, voice steely. "A company executive harboring a minor with no familial ties, in private residence, no oversight, no process." Some of the board members shifted in their seats, others stared down at their phones, avoiding her gaze. "I propose a temporary suspension of Mr. Coleman's duties until we can evaluate his judgment." "He's a co-owner," one board member mumbled. "He's not just an employee." Victoria's eyes flashed. "Then we question his capacity to lead." At the hospital, Elaine Williams had stabilized, but remained nonverbal, sedated, unconscious. A waiting game. Richard sat by her side for hours. Zoe never asked him to, but he went anyway. He watched her chest rise and fall, tubes snaking from her arms, and wondered for the first time in decades what kind of man his father had truly been. That night, back at the penthouse, Zoe handed him her school notebook. "Page 27, she said. Richard opened it and stopped breathing. Neatly taped to the page was an old newspaper clipping. A photo. His father, William Coleman, smiling beside factory workers in front of a building labeled Coleman Textiles. Standing 2 rows behind him was a young Elaine Williams. "My mother worked there before she got sick, before she was just a tenant. She was a seamstress for your family's first business. But she wasn't just any worker. She kept records." Richard flipped the page. Dozens of names, notes, signatures, all in Zoe's careful handwriting, copied from documents her mother had stored away in a wooden box beneath the bed. "She said your father promised stock options, retirement benefits, shared ownership." He remembered, faintly, a whisper from a board meeting decades ago. Scandal. A quiet payout. Buried. "How did she keep all this?" he asked. "She was an assistant secretary back then, before the factory shut down, before your father replaced her with someone who wouldn't ask questions." Zoe's eyes were calm, but blazing. That someone was Victoria Reynolds. Richard stared at the notebook. Each line, each note, a thread pulled from a tapestry of lies. This, he whispered, could destroy her. Zoe shrugged. It's not about her. It's about us. The news spread like wildfire. Boston's headlines screamed of scandal at Coleman Estates. Decades of racial discrimination uncovered. Coleman family legacy shattered. Corporate fraud exposed. Victoria Reynolds ousted. Stock prices plummeted. Investors panicked. The company's polished image fractured before the world's eyes. In the newly appointed interim boardroom, where once only white men in tailored suits decided the fate of properties in predominantly black neighborhoods, there now sat representatives from those very communities, people who finally had a voice. Richard stood at the head of the table, flanked by Zoe and Elaine. The symbolism was not lost on anyone. "This is just the beginning," Richard declared. "We have a responsibility, not only to right past wrongs, but to change how business is done." Meanwhile, behind closed doors, Victoria Reynolds faced federal indictments on charges of fraud, forgery, and obstruction of justice. Her empire crumbled faster than she could imagine. Yet the one question gnawed at her most: how had a child unearthed secrets that seasoned lawyers had buried? The answer was closer than anyone thought. Elaine Williams had been much more than a seamstress. In her early days at Coleman Estates, she was assistant secretary, trusted with sensitive documents that others would never see. Sensing the brewing betrayal, she quietly collected and hid evidence for years, waiting for the right moment to reveal the truth. "I kept it all," Elaine confessed to Zoe during a quiet afternoon at home. "Not for revenge, for justice." Zoe nodded, her eyes burning with determination. "That's why I had to find out who Richard really was." Their bond deepened. 3 generations intertwined by blood, privilege, and a shared hunger for justice. Back at the penthouse, Zoe's sewing room had transformed. Where once she mended clothes for a few dollars, now she led a team of young seamstresses, creating a line of school uniforms to be donated to public schools in underprivileged areas. Her project was a beacon of hope. One crisp fall afternoon, as Zoe adjusted a newly finished dress for her mother, Richard entered carrying an old wooden box. "I found this in my father's files," he said reverently. Inside were dozens of sketches, uniform designs, and corporate clothing signed by Elaine Williams from 20 years ago. "You knew all along," Richard's voice cracked. Elaine smiled faintly. "I never drew for money or fame. I drew because I loved it. That's why your father's designs were good, and now that's why Zoe's are too." Zoe grinned. "Talent runs in the family." But transformation wasn't just in fabric and documents. In the heart of Boston, Coleman and Williams Holdings emerged. A new company with a new mission. 40% of shares were allocated to a reparation fund supporting former employees and their descendants, scholarships for Black youth, and community-led development projects. Contracts now. The months that followed were a whirlwind of change, challenge, and unexpected growth. Coleman and Williams Holdings quickly became a symbol, not just of corporate reform, but of a new kind of justice, one stitched together by empathy, courage, and the relentless pursuit of truth. Richard found himself thrust into unfamiliar roles: mentor, advocate, and sometimes scapegoat. Board meetings were no longer sterile affairs. Representatives from the communities once ignored now sat with real power, shaping decisions that impacted their lives. Yet the transformation was not without resistance. Victoria Reynolds, now behind bars, still wielded influence through loyalists who whispered in shadowed halls, threatening lawsuits and smear campaigns. But Zoe, now a young leader, was undeterred. At school, she juggled homework and activism. Her sewing classes evolved into entrepreneurship workshops, empowering girls from marginalized backgrounds to envision futures beyond their zip codes. Elaine, though still recovering, took on a quiet role of counselor and inspiration, reminding Zoe daily of the strength that lies in resilience. One afternoon, as Zoe prepared a presentation on community empowerment, Richard entered with a familiar wooden box. "I found something," he said, setting it on the table. Inside were sketches and faded photos, evidence of Elaine's early contributions, long overshadowed by corporate greed. "This is our history," Richard said softly. "Our responsibility." Zoe smiled. "And our future." The company's redevelopment plans were approved by the city council with unanimous support. Unlike previous projects, this one promised to uplift without uprooting, to build bridges instead of walls. Zoe's sewing school blossomed, and soon the first class of 30 girls graduated, many heading to colleges with scholarships funded by the Reparation Fund. Richard reflected during an interview, "We learned that wealth without purpose is empty. Privilege without responsibility is violence. True legacy is measured in lives changed, not dollars earned." But beneath the successes lay hard truths. The scars of decades-long injustice didn't heal overnight. The journey forced Richard to confront uncomfortable questions about his family's past and his own complicity. For Zoe, every stitch sewn was a reminder of battles still to be fought. Yet together they wove a tapestry of hope, fragile but fierce. Winter cast a silvery hush over Boston, the city lights shimmering like distant stars through frost-coated windows. In the Coleman Williams penthouse, 3 generations gathered: Elaine, her daughter Zoe, and Richard, bound by blood, by past sorrows, and by the promise of a new dawn. The sewing room buzzed softly with the hum of machines, but tonight it was quiet. Richard held a fragile drawing in his hands, an original sketch from Elaine, dated 2 decades ago. "I never drew for money," Elaine said, her voice trembling but resolute. "I drew because it was who I was." Zoe, now 13, smiled proudly. "That's why my designs shine, because I'm carrying on her passion." Richard's eyes misted. "And I'm finally learning that true inheritance isn't wealth or property, but justice and dignity." Outside, the city thrummed with life, a mosaic of cultures, struggles, and dreams. The Coleman and Williams names had merged not only in business, but in purpose. Their company now stood as a beacon for equity, investing in communities once ignored, creating opportunities that transcended color and class. On the walls of the newly established Arts and Crafts School, Zoe's framed sketches hung alongside portraits of women who had fought for change, silent reminders of battles fought and victories won. One evening, as Richard prepared to speak at a city event, Zoe tugged his sleeve. "Dad," she said softly, "thank you for seeing me." He knelt, tears shining. "Thank you for showing me what I was blind to." Together, they stepped onto the stage, ready to share their story. A story not just of pain and injustice, but of healing, courage, and the power to rewrite a legacy. Because sometimes it takes a small hand with a needle and thread to sew together worlds torn apart.